audience and our interesting guests, Raphael Tsavkko and Miquel Strubell, to today's event at the Conference on the Future of Europe, which is called Fake News and Disinformation Against Political Dissident in the EU, the cases of Poland, Hungary, and Spain. Today, we have not only participants in the Zoom room, but also viewers via YouTube and Facebook. Thank you very much for joining us today. The content of these presentations and the debate with questions and answers will be collected in a set of recommendations that we will deliver to the EU Commission. In order to let you know that, take care of the kind of speech you take after this in the debate. First, please allow me to give a brief introduction to today's topic and introduce both speakers. The use of fake news and disinformation by state authorities against democratic movements in the EU to deny them legitimacy and even criminalize them is on the rise. This is an alarming trend to the extent that it contributes to the erosion of the quality of democracy in Europe and paves the way for the rise of hate speech. Within this framework, the Catalan National Assembly, a civil society organization from Catalonia, is holding this session today in the framework of the Conference for the Future of Europe of the European Commission, which will focus on addressing the cases of Hungary, Poland, and Spain. The goal of the session is to address the multiple social and political aspects of these trends, EU treaty responsibilities of member states and EU authorities concerning these cases, and overall to discuss possible measures and tools to enhance democracy and free public debate on topics related to civil and political rights throughout Europe. We have two guests together with us this evening, which I want to introduce. Raphael Tsavkko received his PhD in human rights, focusing on migration and diaspora from the University of Deusto. Raphael is also a freelance journalist with 10 years of experience specializing in the intersection of tech and politics, human rights development, as well as international politics, human rights, racism, feminism, Spanish and Brazilian politics, international conflicts, and minority issues. He also writes about culture, particularly Latin culture, music, cinema, and TV, and about environmental issues. He has published in major news outlets such as Al Jazeera, Wired, MIT Tech Review, BBC, Foreign Policy, The Washington Post, etc. Miquel, our second guest tonight, is member of the Lingua Pax board, and he took a BA in Psychology and Physiology at the University of Oxford and a Master of Science in Psychology of Education at the London University, and also a degree in psychology at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. He worked mainly as a language planner in the field of promotion of Catalan for the Catalan government and as a professor and researcher at the Open University of Catalonia. He is the author of a well-documented 273-page book, Lying for Unity: How Spain Uses Fake News and Disinformation to Block Catalonia's Independence. He shows us his book, where he argues that the Catalan independence movement has been attacked by the Spanish authorities using, among other strategies, disinformation, manipulation, and accusations of indoctrination. It exposes the insistent attempts by the Spanish authorities to engage in large-scale disinformation as one of its strategies, along with endless threats and lawfare to try to discredit, decapitate, and counter what is in fact an entirely peaceful democratic movement. After this brief introduction of our distinguished guests, we now come to the central part of our event. Here, both guests will first make a statement on one of the topics we have suggested and then answer to questions from us. Afterwards, we will offer the audience the opportunity to ask questions via the chat function on YouTube or Facebook, as well as give the floor to the audience present here in the Zoom room for any questions it may have. So we would like to start with Raphael. Raphael is going to talk to us about the rise of fake news and disinformation campaigns by public authorities and pro-governmental media in Poland and Hungary against democratic movements and opposition, to what extent it poses a threat to democracy and paves the way for the rise of authoritarianism reactions from the EU authorities in this regard. So, Raphael, I would say the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bàrbara. Moltes gràcies a l'Assemblea Nacional Catalana per la invitació. Thank you to the Assemblea Nacional Catalana for the invitation to this event. It's quite an interesting and relevant topic, definitely. What we're witnessing now in Catalonia is just a sample of the growing process of authoritarianism and police state that has been going on in Poland and Hungary, and obviously other countries around the world for several years now. Not that the situation, for instance, in the Basque Country for many years wasn't quite similar. We had newspapers closed, political parties banned, political leaders sent to jail. And I remember in a previous event that I had the pleasure also to debate with Miquel for the Foreign Friends of Catalonia, that I reminded that the situation of Catalonia is still quite far from what the Basques have faced for many years. So, and by that, I mean, there's still a lot of room for the situation to get way worse for Catalans. So yeah, there's a lot to be discussed, a lot to worry, and a lot to be done in order for the situation of Catalonia not to go as bad as was in the Basque Country for several years. And the Catalonia situation obviously is terrible. What's going on now with political prisoners, with persecution of activists, with threats of parties being banned. There were talks about the coup be banned a couple of months or years ago. Also the persecution of several activists all over Catalonia and even outside, arrest orders against Puigdemont and other political leaders of Catalonia, etc. But Spain still has a lot to learn, if we can put it this way, from Poland and Hungary, from what they have been doing for several years now, both with the Law and Justice Party in Poland and Viktor Orban in Hungary. So focusing specifically on media, disinformation and fake news in Hungary and Poland, we can say that the phenomenon of fake news and disinformation is obviously not new, nor the fact that governments and journalists and also newspapers aligned to such governments and to political parties make use of fake news, of disinformation, of news that sometimes appear to be real or have some grain of truth. They are manipulated to attack opposition individuals, opposition parties, and obviously for these individuals to stay in power. Trump in the US, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Lukashenko in Belarus, and of course, Andrzej Duda and his Law and Justice Party in Poland, and as I've mentioned, Viktor Orban in Hungary, are the first examples that often come to mind. But obviously they are not alone. You have several examples, both from the right, from the left. You have examples in Europe, in Latin America, Africa, Asia, pretty much every continent. You have examples of political parties and leaders in power and sometimes also in opposition using fake news to advance their agendas, advance their narratives. So there's an interesting question an interesting point on the question that what comes first, authoritarian regimes or fake news? And sometimes we end up falling a bit on the idea of egg and the chicken, who came first. So we can actually deal with both issues together. Fake news, authoritarianism, they come together, they walk hand by hand. Authoritarian leaders and wannabe authoritarian leaders, those who are just still trying to get there, they tend to heavily use fake news as a resource, almost as a governing tool, not only for internal audiences, but often to deceive external audiences and organizations. And to that extent, I would say that the Spanish government is so far a master to use fake news to deceive the European Union and several other countries in Europe to what they have actually been doing in Catalonia and what they have done in the Basque Country. So what these authoritarian leaders, they often hope to achieve is not exactly for even the population to believe in the fake news, although they often do, but at least to create doubts, to cast doubt on what is actually the truth. and often to buy some time for them to promote their initiatives before a new position can arise. And also, obviously, to create a greater challenge for the media, the independent media, to report events correctly and to convince the population that what they're reporting is actually the truth, or at least something more similar or more closer to the truth than what the governments are trying to sell. In Poland, media audiences are often exposed to internationally well-recognized conspiracies, like the anti-vax movement or the chemtrail conspiracies. And this is often something tailored to prevent the population from actually discussing relevant topics for themselves and for the country. This is something that often happens in Brazil. There are a lot of fake news with anti-vax, chemtrails, flat earthers, and conspiracy that communists are about to take over the country, and etc., as a way to keep the public discussing nonsense instead of actually discussing what is relevant, how Bolsonaro is trying to promote a coup in Brazil, overthrow institutions, the Supreme Court, and etc. And this is something that takes place also in Poland. The ruling party, the Law and Justice, they have taken over the public broadcaster, the main TV channel. And they have created pretty much a safe space for fake news and for official information of the government, of the political party that's running the government nowadays. And they have cracking down on media freedom in the country. And one of the greatest dangers when you rig the political public channels, in the case, the Polish political public channel, is that in general, the viewing population, they don't immediately notice the editorial change. It's something that a lot of people in Spain also have been complaining with the public Spanish television, that have been changing the editorial line bit by bit. And there's a big habit factor involved when we talk about media, our official media channels, that fake news and misleading news are more easily digested by the population when they follow this often habitual channels, the channels they have the habit to watch. So it's easier for the government, for those who have these authoritarian wishes and etc., to impose their own agenda, their own narrative. And the ruling party in Poland has a clear anti-EU position. They are clearly xenophobic, populist, often homophobic. And also the government constantly launches smear campaigns against opponents, sometimes using official channels or using aligned newspapers and aligned journalists. Authoritarian leaders like Duda, like Orban, Trump, or Bolsonaro, they tend to use the media as a theater, as a stage to gain the attention of the population. The idea is to make a spectacle. So the content of the speeches, they often don't matter as much as the image and as the performance. So it doesn't matter if at one day Orban or Bolsonaro or Duda or Duterte, they said something, and the other day, 2 days later, they say something completely different. What it matters is that they have the media attention. They are reaching a vast audience. And at the same time, they are humanizing themselves. They are trying to pose as human leaders, that are Democrats, they're every day on television speaking to the population. They're explaining themselves, even sometimes justifying and even saying, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Like the Polish President Duda, for instance, is often homophobic, but recently he gave a speech calling for tolerance. So it doesn't really matter. It's more like, oh, he's saying that he's tolerant. He's saying that he needs people to be tolerant. This is for an outside audience, like he's softening his speech, but inside his policies haven't changed. And this is quite important. Bolsonaro, for instance, in Brazil often does the same. One day he says he's against vaccination. The other day he says he's buying vaccines. And then again, I'm not going to get vaccinated myself, but if you want, go ahead. So this is a way to talk to the people, to show themselves as like a people person. I'm being accountable. So in fact, once you have the control over the media, which is the main goal of social authoritarian leaders, you can attack your opponents and disguise your actions. And also you can just show the opposition as if they were not patriotic enough. They're agents of a third country. They're not doing enough to help the country. They're just trying to change the discourse. What is important for the country right now, what they're saying is not as important as what the government is saying. Trump was a master in use this this kind of disguise, always saying that the Democrats are not worried enough with the country. What they're saying is not exactly what the people want to hear, what is important for the people. This is also typical of authoritarian leaders. In a sense, that's what happens a lot in Spain when the current government says that the Catalan issue is not so important, and what the Catalans are trying to do is just to make people worry about issues that are not exactly what the Spanish people need and want. And so we see there is a lot of fluidity between these discourses amongst authoritarian leaders and governments. And again, in Poland, the government has been using the media to justify actions such as the control of the judiciary system. In case of Hungary, to justify the expulsion of the Central European University using old anti-Semitic tropes against George Soros, which is one of the biggest financiers of the Central European University. The same discourse also happens in Brazil against Soros. For instance, Bolsonaro supporters always talk about how Soros is horrible, how he supports international NGOs against the interests of the country. So it's an idea of also always using an external agent, an agent with money, with power, that is trying to overthrow the government and doesn't understand the needs of the population. And once you convince the population, you can grab even more power, weakening institutions and centralizing all the decisions into one hand or the hands of the party, of a political party or political movement. So those leaders, they often focus in one or a set of enemies to justify their actions and their power grab. In Hungary, they often target Soros, they target asylum seekers, that they are against the wishes of the population of Hungary. They are gonna create problems for within this idea of the Hungarian people, because they're outsiders, they don't understand our culture, which is also typical from every far-right leader nowadays that we have in Europe and all over the world. And also to say that the opposition doesn't know how to deal with the problem, as if migrants and asylum seekers were a problem, and etc. Orban goes even further, creating bogus opposition parties just to divide them, just to divide the opposition and to secure the victory. And for instance, the 2018 national elections, international monitors concluded that opposition never stood a real chance because every major news outlet was controlled by the government. So they basically had no penetration whatsoever. Something that is starting to turn. Now the mayor of Budapest is an opposition, is an opponent to Orban, and they are really trying to change things a bit in Hungary, although it's quite still difficult. So this shows that once you control the media, you don't even have to rig the elections. You can manipulate the public enough so that they will vote the way you want them to vote. And that's why discussing fake news is so important. So today we call it fake news, but we have this information for ages, for dozens of years. Fake news is just the new way that we put it, because we have Facebook, we have Twitter, so we have a easier way maybe to manipulate than we had before. But manipulation is pretty much still the same. So once you control the media and you feed the public with fake news, with disinformation, you can easily control the narrative. So for instance, Orban, he packed the judiciary with his loyalists, just like Poland is doing now. He redrew the electoral map, changed the electoral laws. He gave ethnic Hungarians who never set foot on the country the right to vote. He gutted the civil services, appointed loyalists in watchdog agencies, and amended the constitution. So in sum, he did everything he could to take complete control of the country. And in both cases, the EU launched condemnatory messages against Poland and against Hungary, has taken legal action against the countries. The EU Commission recently started legal action against Hungary and Poland for violating fundamental rights of the LGBT population. The European Union Court of Justice ruled against Poland, and Poland defied the rule. And the European presented a second report on the state of the rule of law in the EU, I guess was in last July, also mentioning that both Poland and Hungary are highly problematic. And among other things, they demand judicial reforms in both countries, decisive actions against to combat corruption, and to reinforce democracy and democratic institutions. And in most cases, it fell in deaf ears. So the EU legal actions and condemnations have led both Poland and Hungary to threaten to leave the EU. And both countries have decided mostly just to ignore the EU. But what is interesting in both cases is that the EU took measures to at least say, okay, this is not good, what you're doing is not okay, you have to make reforms. They set in motion measures, they are threatening to cut funds, EU funds to both countries and etc. But when it comes, I'm sorry, to Spain, the European Union haven't done pretty much anything. It's just some scattered decisions in courts, but mostly set in motion by Catalan activists, or in many cases by Basque activists in the past. As for instance, I've mentioned when I started speaking that we had newspapers closed in Spain. It was the Egine de Guncaria. And just a few years ago, maybe last year, I don't remember quite exactly, maybe 1-2 years ago, an European court said that the closure of newspapers was unlawful. But in the meantime, the newspapers were shut down, journalists were sent to jail. Marcelo Otamendi, who was the editor of one of the newspapers, was brutally tortured by the police, Spanish police. So it was just many, many years later. The same case of when the leaders of Bateragune, the political party that was being built by Arnaldo Otegi and other leaders of the Basque left, they were sent to jail and they spent, I guess, 5 or 6 years in jail. And then again, the European court said, okay, that was unlawful. So just after the fact, it's quite ineffective, and normally Spain doesn't really care. Spain has been convicted several times for not investigating torture, for torturing citizens, Basque citizens, and etc., and nothing has changed. And what's probably going to happen now is that in the Catalan case, there are several lawsuits in motion in European courts. And after something major happens, the decision will come and say, okay, Spain, you did it and you shouldn't have done it, but it won't make much difference. So obviously what Catalonia needs is a more firm decision, more firm stances, needs all the countries to jump in and discuss the situation and call Spain to, really profoundly change the way the judiciary works, which is completely politicized and not independent, and how they are doing politics and discussing the Catalan issue. That I believe Miquel now will speak with much more arguments and callers about how Spain is heading to the similar situation of Hungary and Poland and other authoritarian countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Raphael. Thank you very much for these interesting remarks. And I was just making some notes, and it was scary to me when I heard you say that the authoritarian regimes try to create a safe space for fake news. It's like a kind of oxymoron when you talk about safe space and fake news. We will certainly come back to later in the debate. I would now thank you, and I would like to ask Miquel to take the floor and to relate on the use of fake news and disinformation by the Spanish authorities and media against Catalonia, which is also the topic of his book we already have been talking about. So the floor is yours, Miquel. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Barbara. And thank you for inviting me. I'm pleased to renew my long-standing attachment to the Assemblea, which in fact started before it was formally founded. And I've been a follower of many of its activities, including those huge annual demonstrations, which I think are obviously not strictly political in electoral terms, but I think have made a very big impact on in visual terms on public opinion in many countries. So good evening, everyone. I think fake news falls into one of two kinds of group or a group will do either misinformation or disinformation. Misinformation, which we're not talking about today, is inaccurate information, though the person or the medium disseminating it may not actually be aware that this information is inaccurate. And on the other hand, what is called disinformation, in which deliberate falsehoods may be disseminated even by reputable media. In both cases, sometimes these media correct themselves when the error is pointed out, but by no means always, as maybe we shall see. As Raphael said quite rightly, fake news has been going around a long time, and for, let's say, colonial ends as well. The Vikings in the probably 9th or 10th century, when they discovered Iceland, which had no name, of course, when they came back home, they said, "Oh, we found a big island. You must go and colonize it. It's called Iceland." But I don't think their efforts were very successful. So when they, a few years later, discovered what they called Greenland, why did they call it green when it's less green in Greenland than anywhere in the world, except for the large deserts? Well, I think the reason is that was a propaganda campaign. It was an attempt to get Viking Scandinavians to colonize what they were promised was a green land. So these things have been going on for a very long time. So disinformation is, as I say, deliberate lying, the deliberate use of false information in order to achieve one of several goals, a number of goals. I mean, they may be commercial, they may be political, they may be social. In this particular session, I think we're going to deal with the goal of trying to suppress dissent by trying to attack political opponents with fake news. In this context, this is one of the various strategies that can be devised to attack dissenters. Another is the use of lawfare that has already been mentioned, the twisting of the law that we've seen so much of in South America, recently in Myanmar and many other countries, as Raphael outlined very, very correctly, to remove politicians from power. We're not going to discuss lawfare principally today, beyond observing that it is at least less dramatic than the often used physical liquidation of opponents, which is becoming less popular, let's put it that way. Note, though, that while disinformation may be aimed at general public opinion to criminalize one's chosen victim or victims, the effect on judges, prosecutors, and even defense counsel of fake news may be highly damaging. After all, they're humans, unless it's revealed for what it is. And it may well influence such people and affect judges' verdicts in trials, especially if the alleged crimes have purportedly been committed hundreds of kilometers from the capital, where the most influential national and international media tend to be concentrated. I think most of us will agree that it was Mr. Trump's first presidential campaign that put fake news in these terms in the forefront of the political scene. We discovered, wow, thousands of kidnapped children in the sewers of New York. We found Mrs. Clinton engaging in multiple criminal offenses. And then, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic split the world in two. Those who did or did not believe it was a deliberate plan by the elite to cut the world's population with what turned out not to be, well, far less deadly virus than its immediate precedent. So a fairly ineffectual attempt at that. But I'm here mainly to talk about Spain. And without a doubt, Catalonia has allowed the use of fake news, mainly by the Spanish media, and not only those based in Madrid, to make the headlines in the context of the Catalans' claim to nationhood, following the partial striking down by Spain's Constitutional Court of Catalonia's revised regional constitution, which is known as the Statute of Autonomy. This law was drafted by the Catalan Parliament, adopted by the Spanish Parliament with many amendments reducing its content, and significantly ratified by the Catalan people in a, by definition, binding referendum. All of this was laid down in the Constitution. All the steps were taken really strictly according to the Spanish Constitution, and then the Spanish Constitutional Court, which is, well, I'll leave adjectives out, decided that part of what had even been ratified by a binding referendum was not constitutional. So as from 2010 then, the date of this ruling, which was at the behest of the main right-wing party, the Nationalist Partido Popular, the Catalan nationalist parties, I use the term with some trepidation as it means very different things in different countries. In Catalonia, a land where over half of the adult population, that is the electoral census, have not a single Catalan-born grandparent. In Catalonia, these are inclusive parties. So as I was saying, the Catalan nationalist parties move steadily towards breaking away from Spain in order to be able to legislate locally instead of largely having to rely on the always fickle parliamentary majorities in the Spanish parliament. Before explaining some good examples, to my mind, of fake news, allow me to point out something that is very significant in Spain. The Catalans particularly, but also the Basques, are the victims of deeply ingrained prejudice and negative attitudes, particularly at the collective level. All Catalans gone to Madrid, chatted with people, and get in reply, "Oh, for a Catalan, you're very simpatico, you're a very, very nice person," surprised. Catalans are widely described as selfish, stingy, inward-looking, which is enough to rule them out, though to be fair, they're also seen as industrious, reliable, and relatively well-educated. The stereotype for many is remarkably similar to that of the Jews. This means that any anti-Catalan campaign is likely to be successful in Spain, including winning votes, mainly outside Catalonia, of course. It helps explain why the public prosecutor in the south of Spain, that's Andalusia, did not press charges against the town of Coripe in 2019. I quote Catalonia's President Puigdemont's comment: "Today, in a town in Spain governed by the Socialist Party, they decided to shoot at and burn a doll that looked like me and that wore a visible yellow ribbon, as he did." Shooting at and burning a rag doll representing a despicable person is apparently an annual tradition in this village every Easter. They burn a Judas. So against this backdrop began a series of false claims against Catalan politicians. Former President Pujol was accused of having money in Liechtenstein, as was Barcelona's mayor, Dr. Xavier Trias, and President Artur Mas. Some of these accusations were accompanied by faked images of account numbers and appeared in the anti-Catalan press. I can only describe it that way: Libertad Digital, OK Diario, El Mundo, and others. And some of these accusations were suspiciously close to particular elections. It's likely that Dr. Trias lost his own re-election on this account. False police reports, at least no one acknowledged their authorship, started being leaked for the purpose of incriminating Catalan politicians. No judges, no prosecutors came to any conclusion on the authors or the legality of such leaks. Another example of fake news is Operation Judas, the name given by the Civil Guard under the instruction of the Spanish National High Court to an early morning operation on September the 23rd, 2 years ago, just weeks before the Supreme Court verdict that condemned 9 leading politicians and social activists to long jail sentences, in which 9 people also linked to the so-called defense committees of the Republic, the Catalan Republic, were arrested, whisked away to Madrid, and accused of terrorism. All the Spanish media led with this news. It seemed that several of them make fireworks for one of the traditional Catalan cultural groups they call diablos, devils, that spray watchers on and dancers with sparks during pasacalle or nighttime parades. Spanish police claimed to have found precursors of explosives. They spent several months in detention in a Madrid jail before being released by the judge pending trial on the grounds that the evidence was flimsy. And several of the precursors are simply household products you can buy in any supermarket. This is a good point to underline the desperate need for the Spanish authorities to be able to regard the independence movement as violent. This would allow them to accuse Catalans of rebellion, of an armed uprising, or of terrorism. But the Catalan movement has made non-violence one of its cornerstones, and Spain could not intervene in the same way as in the Basque Country, as Raphael mentioned, where violence was manifest on both sides, allow me to add. So fake news reached a frenzy when the Catalan Parliament adopted bills for a binding self-determination referendum in 2017, something the Spanish authorities had turned down over 15 times, despite Article 1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which Spain adhered in 1977, which says very clearly all people have the right of self-determination. And by virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, cultural, and social development. And in the same article, the states party to the present covenant shall promote the realization of the right of self-determination and shall respect that right in conformity with the provisions of the Charter of the United Nations. Well, anyone claiming that the Catalans are not a people within that definition will come up with a lot of opposition in Catalonia. The second second law adopted by the Catalan Parliament on the establishment of the Catalan Republic were the referendum to result in a majority of in favor of independence, which it duly did by over 90% of voters. On that day, fake news flew in all directions. On voting day, as you may remember, Spanish police attacked thousands of people queuing up to vote at their polling stations in attempts to seize the ballot boxes, which they had vainly searched for several weeks, and the ballots. The amount of filmed evidence is colossal. Yet Spanish ministers like Dusty actually told the BBC interviewer that the videos were mostly fake news or from incidents in other countries. The wide-eyed interviewer responded by pointing out that a BBC crew had actually witnessed and filmed one of these attacks. There were later denials that people had been injured. There were thorough analysis of each medical report confirmed that over 1,000 people had been hurt and quite a few in several parts of their bodies. On that day, a Twitter account with a Spanish flag on it spread manipulated news about the death of a police officer from the Basque Country who had supposedly been displaced to Barcelona, where items of fake news claimed that he had died of a heart attack. The truth is that the death of the officer was true, but it had occurred in Valladolid and not in Barcelona. If you know Spanish geography, well, that's about 800 kilometers away. And many other examples of fake news on Twitter with claims attacking the Spanish authorities turned out to be by account holders who had never tweeted before about Catalonia, had no involvement or attachment to the Catalan independence movement, and who instead seemed to want to attack the system for whatever reason. And again, when President Puigdemont went to Brussels with most of the members of his government, before any warrant had been issued for his arrest, and held a press conference there, he began being treated as fugado, as a fugitive, whereas it was perfectly clear what his address was to become a few days later. And every time he'd been summoned or arrested by the authorities in Germany, in Belgium, in Italy just a few days ago, he's immediately responded. And the request for his extradition on grounds of rebellion and sedition have on every occasion been turned down. On each occasion, the Spanish nationalist press went wild with glee, only to be foiled by the outcome. My impression is that Spanish public opinion has been so poisoned by fake news and manipulation by the media that most Spaniards are simply incapable of coping with the cognitive dissonance between their beliefs and the facts. This is a serious state of affairs, and perhaps later in the session, Raphael or I will want to make a comment on this issue. The leaders of both main Spanish political parties have issued strongly worded statements saying that President Puigdemont has to return to Spain to face the courts, the Supreme Court. But several European courts say it's not the right court to try him, even if some offences can be claimed to have been committed. If you agree, Barbara, you seem to be saying yes a lot, which I appreciate.
Yes.
I'll leave things here for the time being. Hopefully people following the session will be able to ask more questions later.
Thank you very much, Miquel. Listening to you and listening to these very clear examples you were giving us, it just suggested to me that maybe if you work on fake news long enough about talking about violence, at the end there is a story. It's a kind of storytelling, so that everyone is really thinking about this violence no one has seen until now. So this could be a good summarize of what you were talking about. Thank you very much, Miquel. We would like to start now, or we would like to go on with a few questions we have been preparing here. So, Raphael, first of all, because you really know about that, we would like to know from you which kind of perceptions of the Catalan question you have noticed that really arrived in the Brussels bubble and in the EU media, and to what extent fake news and disinformation against Catalonia have resonated and are being taken somehow seriously in this context. This would be very interesting to us.
Yeah, here in Brussels, in Belgium, mostly with Politico, for instance, is one of the newspapers who has been covering the Catalan issue, with I would say mostly positive view over the Catalan narrative. Let's just put it this way. Normally covering what Puigdemont is doing, the troubles of Spain trying to arrest him, etc. For what I've been talking to other colleagues, journalists, not just here in Brussels, but all over the Europe, the US and Brazil. Once they have an understanding of what is the real situation, they tend to side with the Catalans. They tend to understand that what Spain is doing is a bit over the top. It's a bit too much. It's interesting that recently the New York Times actually adopted a quite Spanish position. I haven't really been able to understand why. I even wrote a critical piece of what New York Times was doing recently. Coming again with the idea of Russian invasion, that the Russians are behind, which is actually an attempt of Spain to poison the discussions in Europe because everybody's afraid of Russia. So let's just use Russia as the example, the big, scary, post-communist, whatever. So they are trying to use Russia to set forward the narrative that Europe must be careful because the Catalans are siding with Putin, are siding with Russia, which is stupid. And I'm really not sure why the New York Times just sided with Spain on this narrative, but for what I've been reading here in Europe, most news pieces about Catalonia, about Spain, they tend to be more balanced and really give the perspective that obviously Catalans have some right to decide. They have the right to freedom of expression. What is going on with the Catalan political prisoners is obviously an absurd, even if they don't necessarily agree with the idea of independence. But obviously they tend to be more sympathetic to the side of those who are being oppressed by Spain right now.
Okay, that's interesting to know. No one of us will probably be able to explain why the New York Times shifted to this Spanish position. But we wanted to ask you, Miquel, also to this topic, this claims of Russian involvement in the Catalan independence process. Why do you think that the authorities and the Spanish media have fabricated this case without evidences and without any clear idea what is going on, and which consequences can have this on the public opinion in Spain, for example?
Barbara, as they say, I'm very glad you asked that question. Can I just underline something that Raphael has just said?
Of course.
With an example. John Carlin, sports reporter, had a column in El País for many years. Yes. He wrote a letter to the Times in which he said, I would be extremely sorry if Catalonia left Spain. But I can understand it, particularly by the way Prime Minister Rajoy is dealing or not dealing with what was an emerging conflict, political conflict. Well, he was sacked by El País for saying that. He was not in favor of independence. As Raphael says, siding with doesn't mean that you necessarily are in favor of independence. I think that was important to underline. Claims about the alleged Russian connections are scandalous, and I'll come back to El País now. They started in a big way just days before the referendum in September 2017, when El País, and in particular David Alandete, began to publish a theory linking up Russians with the Catalan process. Julian Assange, who's hardly a pro-Russian person, and Anthony Snowden, who maybe were accused of interfering in the Catalan process. Even the EU Foreign Minister, Josep Borrell, ironically Catalan-born, openly accused the Putin government of such involvement and was publicly snubbed by the Russian foreign minister, much to the delight of many Catalans. Well, they made these claims, and an ad hoc committee in the UK Houses of Parliament actually invited Spanish representatives, which included Alandete, included people from the Real Instituto Juan Sebastián Elcano, which presumably is funded by publicly, but is devoted to foreign policy issues. They were invited to London to explain the evidence they had to back up their claim. And they were humiliated by having to admit that they had no hard evidence at all. More recently, still on the Russian side, the Spanish police has confiscated a number of Catalan businessmen, built up a tale, a narrative of political Russian connections with Puigdemont's entourage. And this is called Operation Volkov. For those, our eyes just bulged out of our heads. For those unfamiliar with the World War II Eastern Front, Volkov was a city and a river where the Spanish Blue Division of so-called volunteers, or many were volunteers, fought on Hitler's side against our Russian allies. So even the choice of the name of the operation was very unfortunate, to put it mildly. Well, these people had their mobile phones confiscated, and all their WhatsApp messages about everything everything you could possibly imagine, were put into the mixer, and out came a wonderful series of claims, such as, very serious claim by one of them that there were 10,000 Russian soldiers waiting for orders to support Catalan independence. And they're basically commercial ventures which are interpreted as secret ways of funding the independence process. Well, all of this, I think Raphael more or less insinuated, is a strategy to try and make sure the EU, which has set up bodies to verify affirmations, that's fact-checking bodies, and to filter fake news, largely because of insinuations or suspicions that Russia is indeed involved, to make sure that the EU will not look kindly on Catalonia's claim to nationhood, the pursuit of which has always been, perhaps grudgingly, declared to be a legitimate aim by none other than Spain's Supreme Court.
Thank you very much, Miquel, for also these explanations about these examples that show us how it is working in Spain and how they are working on this problem. We would like to know from both of you, so I would like to direct this next question to both of you, so that you can answer from your own perspective. Which kind of implications and consequences this use of disinformation and fake news by the Spanish authorities and the Spanish nationalist media against Catalonia can have for the pro-indie movement? So, and which, if you see an impact in terms of paving the way of the criminalization of this movement, the use of lawfare, the rise of hate speech, do you think all these topics are linked to each other, so there is a right strategy? And if you do so, do you think this will work? Is this really trying or achieving a kind of dehumanization of the Catalan people, so that the democratic values in Spain are erosionating, and maybe we have a change in the society and in the way of looking at this problem and this conflict with Catalan people and the pro-indie movement? Maybe Raphael, you may start, and then Miquel.
Yeah, sure. Just one brief comment about my previous comment is that when I was talking obviously about the Brussels bubble, was more, I was mentioning the English newspapers, because the French or the Dutch press, they vary. Normally, in the case here of Belgium, if the media outlet is closer to the NVA, then you have Vlaamse Alliantie, which is a political party who has actually taken Puigdemont, has helped him and everything to settle and etc. The youths definitely see a more favorable position. And obviously, it depends from media to media, but my focus was mostly the English-speaking, like political, Brussels Times, and etc.
Yeah.
Specifically about fake news and criminalization, etc. As I've mentioned before, Miquel as well, there is an attempt to say that Russia is behind everything that is going on in Catalonia. So as a way to scare the European public and institutions that if they support Catalonia, they will be supporting Russia. This is one clearer point of discussion. But obviously, media in Spain, they can claim responsibility if anything more violent takes place against Catalans, because they have been pushing for tougher measures. They were acting as cheerleaders in 2017 after the referendum, and I was in Catalonia helping with the barricades and taking pictures and following the media, and it was just absolutely crazy. They were pretty much saying that violence was the answer in Catalonia. And one thing that I find particularly worrisome is that when you read from El País, from Público, you go to more far-right newspapers, everything about Catalonia seems to be the same. It doesn't matter if it's from a left-wing perspective or right-wing perspective. Obviously, there are exceptions, but from all political ideologies, you see the same take on what is going on in Catalonia. That is an absurd, that is unacceptable, that Catalans, they are fascists, they don't support the idea of united EU because they want to split. And all this obviously is gonna create hatred towards Catalans because they are the ones trying to implode Spain. They're trying to destroy Spain. That's the same hatred that was directed towards Basques for many years. Whenever you spoke about the Basque Country, the first thing that people remember was ETA, was terrorism. Even I remember when I was studying for my master's and my PhD, that in both cases I studied the Basque Country, I studied Basque identity and Basque nationalism. Everybody, the first question everybody asked me was, "Oh, but isn't it dangerous? I mean, because they are all terrorists, and isn't terrorism what they do?" And so, yeah, the media had a very important role in spreading this. I remember many years ago, I wrote a piece for a newspaper in Brazil, exactly talking about how every time there was anything about the Basque Country, even when they're talking about music, culture, travel, or culture or whatever, there was always a final line saying ETA has killed about 700 people in the Basque Country. They always had to talk about ETA. At least in Brazil, there was a reality. So you create a sense that every time that everything that relates to these people, to this population, relates also to terrorism, relates to split, relates to violence, and etc. And that's what it's going on now in Catalonia. Every time you read something in a Spanish newspaper, it's in a derogatory way. Fortunately, at least when I'm reading newspapers in Brazil or reading English media, reading newspapers from Germany and etc., mostly English-speaking media, you see some more balanced takes on what is going on in Catalonia. Not always, obviously, but at least Catalans have been quite successful in spreading their message. Particularly also because Spain alone can just implode its own efforts with this international warrants against Puigdemont, against other political leaders and etc. All the violence that took place in 2017 ran the world. Everybody saw it. The scenes of old people being beaten by the police for just trying to vote. So Spain in itself alone is doing a great job of helping Catalans worldwide when it comes to the media. But obviously, this Russian link is just another attempt to scare the European population. And I'm pretty sure that they have other plans to try to convince the international public that the Catalans are in the wrong, and they are the ones who don't want to dialogue, to discuss anything, and etc. And obviously, this will, in the long run, if Catalans are not as successful as they are now to oppose this narrative, I think that Spain will try to make things harder for Catalans and for the image of Catalonia all over the world.
Okay, Miquel?
I'm sure that Spanish diplomacy has spent a great deal more than the 6 million odd euros that since 2011, well before the fully fledged independence movement reached the political level, are being claimed by the Court of Auditors, which is not a court of law. A lot of them are political appointees. A lot of the staff are relatives of the political appointees. And they, without granting any right to defense, decide who they're going to fine for what misdemeanors. This is something I wanted to mention in this presentation. It's not strictly fake news, but all the evidence that they have to try and fine Catalan leaders and civil servants is very tenuous, to say the least. And what can Catalonia's foreign policy do? Will explain the situation to the world. And I've been on a number of missions to do that. I've been invited to a number of sessions there, and there was always someone from the unionist, if we can call it that, opposition. So I think all of this is unfounded, but it's part of a strategy. As we were saying earlier, there's a very large strategy, which partly is based on convincing local public opinion in Spain that repressive measures are legitimate. And we keep insistently repeating, this is a political conflict, and a political solution is the only way to put an end to the conflict. But as each day goes by, there are new trials of, there's over 3,000 people either awaiting trial or have already been tried. So let's say the repression has not stopped, however much the Spanish government wants to talk about dialogue and looking for solutions. The first way would be to stop the repression. So influencing public opinion in Spain, I think, is the main objective of the Spanish government. But they have spent a lot of money, nice glossy publications explaining all the falsehoods that the Catalan independence movement is supposedly trying to disseminate. So they've been doing a lot of work there. They've tried to ban any number of university conferences or seminars on the issue. So I would say that in Europe, as Raphael says, people are beginning to see through the facade of Spain. And of course, you have to remember that the European Court of Human Rights is very slow and usually acquits, it's not exactly the right word, cancels the verdicts of Spanish courts, a few weeks after the person who spent years in prison has come out of prison. And I think what is extremely important here is the fact that the European Parliament is now involved. The European Parliament was tricked into waiving the immunity, parliamentary immunity, or at least part of it, of 3 Catalan MEPs, including President Puigdemont, and that has been taken to the European Court of Justice. And that is, let's say, a more direct level of intervention. But as I think we've all three agree, Spain doesn't really seem to, at least purportedly, well, visibly take any notice of anything that any European court says. So what the outcome will be is open to doubt. But as I say, on this occasion, it's the Parliament itself that has been accused of allowing Spanish manipulation of its MEPs. That verdict will be extremely important, and that's expected early next year.
Thank you very much, Miquel, for this last remarks and comments on the court, on the EU court, because this was one of the questions already arrived from the audience. We would now open the debate and start first of all with questions maybe from our public here at the Zoom room. I have seen there is someone who would like to say, do you have a question, Pere Jordi? If you do so, could you please switch your camera on? Oh, I think this doesn't work. So then we can wait that. No, this doesn't work. So Pere Jordi, you can write your question into the chat. So we would then go on with the first question we got over via YouTube or Facebook. So this is a question: what is your opinion concerning the case of journalists that are recruited by state intelligence agencies? To what extent this trend challenges freedom of media? I think both of you can give an answer. Maybe we start with Raphael.
Well, again, not a new phenomenon of journalists and newspapers being on the pocket of governments of authoritarian leaders. That's absolutely not new. Although when we talk about Spain, I believe the situation is even a bit more complicated, because most cases you don't even have to pay them to support the idea of a united Spain. Actually, I was just now remembering of one of famous declaration from José Calvo Sotelo, who was minister of dictator Primo de Rivera, that he once, almost 100 years ago, he said, "Antes una España roja que una España rota. I prefer a red Spain rather than a broken Spain." And he said this in San Sebastián, in Donostia, in the Fronton, I guess in early 1930s. And I believe that this phrase pretty much defines Spain. The idea that I don't care if there's a fascist dictatorship or a communist dictatorship or whatever kind of dictatorship you have, if Spain is together, that's what it works. And what we see the Spanish government using this ideology against Basque activists, now using against Catalan activists. It was used during the Franco dictatorship, during the Primo de Rivera dictatorship. So I think that this defines Spain. And in a sense, when we talk about Poland, we talk about Hungary, we talk about Brazil, or many countries, you definitely have journalists on the pocket of political leaders and etc. And in Spain, I think that they don't actually need it. You have this ideology in Spain of a united Spain, España una y grande, one Spain, a huge Spain. That it's an ideology. It goes from left to right.
Miquel, would you agree?
I completely agree. I think, well, obviously journalists are recruited to work for government departments or parties. I mean, that is perfectly legitimate. But what was being asked was obviously secret recruitment to influence the editorial line or their own position. My impression is that whole newspapers, digital newspapers, have been set up with the primary task of attacking Catalan independence and underlining unity. Thinking, well, I mentioned several before, but OK Diario is a particularly good or bad, however you want to read it, example. And Libertad Digital is also, I think both of those digital media would probably not be banned in Poland or Hungary, but I think they would not be allowed to disseminate their hate speech in many Western European democracies.
Oh, Pere Jordi, could you switch please your micro on? Thank you. So, thank you, Miquel. This would be an interesting question if in other countries it would be allowed, or if they would be really allowed to have this discursive hate speech every day, again and again, against Catalonia or another topic. So we have this question you already started to answer about the upcoming EU Court and Strasbourg Human Rights Court decisions. And the question would be if you think that these upcoming decisions on the Catalan case may have an impact on the EU, or mainly in the Commission, in the EU Commission stance on the conflict stance on the conflict, Catalonia, Spain, and Spanish repressive actions. Do you really think this will have consequences? Miquel already pointed out he doesn't think so. Raphael, do you really believe that these decisions will?
No, I second Miquel. I don't think. I think that only a strong action by the European Commission, by countries that are part of the EU, really pushing diplomatically for Spain to change its ways would make a difference. or maybe obviously a decision of a high European court that would have real power to force Spain to comply. Although, as I've mentioned, the European Union Court has decided against Poland, and Poland just said, okay, I don't care. And so, or just decided make a few changes just to look good, but not necessarily change the core of the whole situation. So threatening to leave the EU and etc. So I think that the EU still has some very weak institutions when it comes to judiciary institution, when it comes to enforce decisions. Countries mostly accept a few of the decisions when they think that it's not really going to impact on their whole policies. It's like the Spain accepting to pay some fines or whatever when the Human Rights Court decides that one arrest was unlawful, there was torture or etc. It's more up to the countries to decide to comply or not. And the EU still lacks some more strong and decisive instruments to make them comply. Although so far, the European Commission has remained silent on everything that is going on in Catalonia. So no, as Miquel, I don't think that is going to make much difference now, any kind of decision now.
The silence about this internal affair, Spanish internal affair.
Exactly.
We have to remember that Europe has two international organizations, as we all know. The Council of Europe, which is an older organization based on human rights, democratic rights, fair elections, and so on. And on the other hand, the European Union, which was founded as a commercial economic area agreement. So those two have courts of law that carry out the treaties of each of the two institutions. The European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, a significant place, right slap in the middle between the two historical warring partners. And we have to be so grateful to the European Union and the Council of Europe that there has been no war between France and Germany for over 75 years. I mean, that is unheard of. And on the other hand, in another bordering country, we have the Luxembourg European Court of Justice, which I agree doesn't have enough punch either. I agree with Raphael. I mean, there are important issues of European policy, particularly in this period when Europe is trying to rebuild a more modern Europe after the pandemic. Well, I mean, that's a bargaining chip that can be used with any country that doesn't respect, for instance, the right of national minorities, which incidentally is the main difference between Poland and Hungary. Poland and Hungary is a battle for power, but it's not a battle against any national minority. Spain is, and I think that deserves the attention of not only both courts, but also the institutions of both organizations. And finally, the Council of Europe came out very strongly against Spain quite recently, and it's of headlines in Spain where the Council of Europe agrees with Spain's policies. Bullshit, sorry, nonsense. It certainly did not. So there again is another example of falsely portraying what is going on in the outside world, which makes the average Spaniard even less in touch with reality. But we'll see whether reality catches up with the Spanish authorities as well.
Yes, in this sense, a viewer commented that in the case of the cruel and violent closure of the Basque newspaper Egunkaria, even though the Spanish court finally cleared the paper and the convicted people, no compensation has been paid until this moment. So he asks you about remarks on this, maybe about taking too long. Is it still justice?
That's one of the things that I've mentioned. It's really troubling and worrisome that the courts take so many years to decide on pretty much anything. And also, even though both in the case of Egunkaria and Egin, the European court said that Spain was in the wrong, there's also the issue that the persecution remains now against Gara, because Gara is considered by the Spanish justice as an heir of both Egin and Egunkaria, and they had to pay hefty fines because they were considered the heirs of those newspapers. Makes absolutely no sense. And obviously, there's probably going to be a lawsuit. I'm not sure if they have started yet, the lawyers of Gara, but it's probably going to have a complaint on European courts. It's going to take another 10, 20, 30 years. European is going to say it was absurd to ask them to pay the fines of older newspapers and etc. And that's just going to be it. That's one of the biggest issues that also Spain counts on, the slow pace of European institutions, European courts, to keep pushing against Basques and Catalans. That's one of the issues. Like imagine how many years it's gonna take for the case of the Catalan political prisoners to reach the courts and for a decision to be made. And Spain is counting on keeping pressure in Catalonia for the Catalans to drop the pledge for independence before the European courts do anything.
Yes, that's the point.
Yeah, I agree. Can we just, again, as an example, remember that a judge was condemned for not investigating tortures in the Basque Country by the European Court of Human Rights, the Council of Europe Court. That judge is now a minister in the government, so it really had no effect on his career, political or otherwise. And this, again, this example setting of people who have been condemned as criminals actually carrying on their daily life thereafter is because they are, they're on our side rather than the other side. That is very distressing and a bad sign. You can see a lot more xenophobic, homophobic violence now than there was 3 years ago, because people get arrested and let out of the back door of a police station. So there's almost complete impunity in things which can develop, blossom, grow up, and poison society as a whole, in my view.
Okay. There is a lot to do. Thank you very much to both of you, Raphael and Miquel. Before we close our event, I would like to make some closing remarks in order to summarize for our audience and also for the paper we are going to send to the Commission. So the use of an external actor, we already heard, like George. So it's the use of these external actors by increasingly authoritarian governments are made in order to justify their actions against political opposition. And this is on the rise in order to manipulate public and audiences. I think we can agree on that. So, and also that what we are now witnessing in Spain against Catalonia is a symbol of the growing process of authoritarian police state that has been going on in Poland and Hungary and other countries around the world. We have been talking about Brazil and about Trump and the US. So fake news and disinformation paved the way to the suppression of dissent and is aimed at attacking political opponents, twisting the law to remove political opposition in a less unpopular way than physically suppressing political rivals. So it's changing, but at the end, it seems to me with same results, not for the person, but for the problem. So in content such as Spain falls police reports are being elaborated to prosecute Catalan politicians, reports which very often have been given credit by Spanish media to criminalize Catalan democratic pro-independence movement. This is also a big problem right now, since the media are always repeating and taking these stories and taking it for granted and suggesting this the situation that they are guilty. So most of the EU media tend to be balanced in giving a perspective on the conflict between Catalonia and Spain, even if they do not sympathize with the idea of Catalan independence. So we also do realize like this in this way in other countries, not only in Brussels, in the EU, but this doesn't mean that this media sympathize with the idea of Catalan independence. It's only like trying to be balanced. And despite of that fact that there is freedom of media in Spain, when it comes to Catalonia, most Spanish media, both in the left and the right, share the same criminalizing narrative against Catalans, which creates hatred and dehumanization, as it happened against the Basque people years ago. This negative narrative also aims at convincing the audience that repressive measures are legitimate. So, and I think this conference today has shown us that there is a lot to do, a lot to denunciate, a lot to tell, and to try to keep fighting for the real freedom of for the media, so that we get back to more information and to less disinformation. And we would like to thank you very much, Raphael and Miquel, for your contributions, for joining us today. And we would like to thank the audience for the questions and for joining us also. And thank you very much to everyone. Have a nice evening and see you next time.
Thank you very much as well.
Thank you, Miquel.
Thank you very much. It was a
Raphael.
pleasure.